The Georgia's sun, a benevolent dictator, ruled the sky, casting long shadows that danced across the manicured lawn. Tyrone Whitaker, a man carved from granite and seasoned by years on the force, inhaled the scent of freshly cut grass, a fragrance that spoke of normalcy, of peace. He ran a calloused hand over the cool, turquoise surface of his pool, the ripples mirroring the quiet satisfaction that settled in his chest. He'd poured sweat and grit into this oasis, every brick, every tile a testament to the new chapter he was building. Retirement, a word that had echoed in his dreams for years, a siren song luring him away from the relentless tide of sirens and flashing lights. He'd spent his life piecing together shattered lives, catching glimpses of humanity's darkest corners. Now, surrounded by the symphony of chirping crickets and the gentle rustle of leaves, he could almost taste the silence he craved. Almost. He built that pool with his own hands, a project born from the ashes of a career that had demanded more than its fair share. He hadn't wanted a contractor. This was his sanctuary, a testament to self-reliance, a tangible symbol of the life he'd earned. For Tyrone Whitaker, that moment came on a warm Friday morning in Mon, Georgia, as he stood by the shimmering water, a glass of sweet tea sweating in his hand. Peace. That's all he wanted. Lord, I earned this, he thought, the sentiment resonating deep within his bones. This little slice of heaven, bordered by a meticulously trimmed hedge and the promise of quiet afternoons, was supposed to be his escape. But paradise, Tyrone was quickly learning, often had unwelcome neighbors. Georgia. Population, just shy of 16,000. A town where everybody knew everybody. A place where gossip traveled faster than the local sheriff's patrol car. Tyrone had chosen it for its tranquility, its slow, southern drawl of a pace. He'd pictured himself rocking on the porch, watching fireflies blink in the twilight. He hadn't factored in Melanie Coington. She lived in the sprawling Victorian next door, a relic of Mon's more affluent past. Melanie, a woman who wore entitlement like a designer handbag, seemed to operate under the delusion that her property lines extended wherever her whims dictated. Tyrone had tried to be reasonable. The first time she'd sauntered across his lawn, her floral-printed caftan billowing in the breeze, he'd chalked it up to a simple mistake. A friendly wave, a polite, "Morning, ma'am. Just so, you know, this is private property." He'd even offered her a glass of iced tea, the southern hospitality ingrained in him rising to the surface despite the prickle of annoyance. She'd taken the tea, her smile as sweet as the Georgia peaches ripening on the trees, and completely ignored his subtle warning. The second time, the annoyance blossomed into a low thrum of frustration. He'd watched from his kitchen window, a mixture of disbelief and rising anger simmering in his gut as she adjusted the strap of her swimsuit and dipped a toe into his pool. He debated marching out there, laying down the law in a tone that wouldn't be misunderstood. But a lifetime of dealing with escalated situations had taught him the value of measured responses. He'd reminded himself that this was his retirement, his peace, and he wouldn't let Melanie Coington steal it. He'd opted for a more formal approach, a registered letter outlining the legalities of trespassing. He'd handed it to her personally, the crisp white envelope a stark contrast to her brightly colored sundress. He'd even maintained a pleasant expression, though his jaw was tight, and the words, "Good afternoon, Mrs. Coington," felt like gravel in his throat. He'd seen the flicker of annoyance in her eyes as she took the letter, her lips tightening into a thin line. "Is this some kind of joke?" she'd asked, her voice laced with disbelief. He'd held her gaze, his years of experience in interrogation giving him an edge she hadn't expected. "It's a notification, ma'am. I'd appreciate it if you respected my property lines." She'd scoffed, the sound sharp and dismissive, and turned back towards her house, leaving the letter unopened on her porch table. The next day, she was back in his pool. Tyrone's carefully constructed peace began to crumble, replaced by a cold, hard determination. He'd spent his career dealing with people who thought they were above the law. He knew how to handle this. The game had changed. He wasn't just a retired cop anymore. He was a man defending his territory, a warrior guarding the fragile peace he'd fought so hard to earn. He installed security cameras, their watchful lenses gleaming like the eyes of a predator in the night. He started a logbook, meticulously documenting every instance of Melanie's trespass, every uninvited splash, every casual violation of his boundaries. He contacted his cousin Denise, a lawyer with a reputation as sharp as a tack, and began building his case. This wasn't about the pool anymore. It was about principle. It was about reclaiming the tranquility he deserved. The scent of chlorine hung in the air, a subtle reminder of the ongoing battle. Tyrone sipped his tea, the sweetness a stark contrast to the bitter taste of injustice that lingered in his mouth. The war for his backyard had begun. The tires crunched on the gravel of his driveway, a familiar sound that usually heralded the quiet solace of home. But today, Tyrone felt a prickle of unease, a discordant note in the usual symphony of suburban tranquility. The wrought iron gate to his backyard, usually securely latched, stood ajar, a black gash against the vibrant green of his meticulously maintained hedges. A ripple of unease, cold and unwelcome, spread through him. He killed the engine, the silence amplifying the rhythmic splashing sounds from beyond the gate. His jaw tightened. He hadn't imagined it. He hadn't overreacted. Someone was in his pool. Again. Exiting the car, he closed the door with a soft click, a deliberate contrast to the thumping in his chest. He walked towards the gate, each step measured, controlled. He was retired, yes, but the years spent on the force had ingrained a certain discipline, a way of approaching the unknown that was both cautious and calculating. He pushed the gate open further, the hinges protesting with a rusty creak. The scene that unfolded before him was a grotesque parody of a summer afternoon. 3 teenagers, 2 girls and a boy, splashed and shrieked in his pool, their laughter grating on his nerves. Towels lay scattered on his patio furniture. A half-eaten bag of chips and discarded soda cans littered the table. His meticulously tended flower beds were trampled, his carefully positioned lounge chairs askew. A slow burn started in his gut, a simmering anger he hadn't anticipated feeling so intensely. He was a man who valued peace, who craved the quiet solitude his retirement promised. But this blatant disregard for his property, for his privacy, was a violation he couldn't ignore. "Excuse me," he said, his voice even controlled. The laughter ceased abruptly. The teenagers turned towards him, their expressions shifting from carefree joy to a mixture of surprise and apprehension. They looked at each other, a silent communication passing between them, before their eyes settled on him. He could see the calculations in their faces, the assessment of his presence, his demeanor. They were young, probably just high school kids, but there was a certain defiance in their gazes, a bravado that grated on him. "Oh, hey," the boy said, his voice tinged with a nervous nonchalance. He hauled himself out of the pool, dripping water onto the patio stones. "We're almost done." His eyes flickered towards the gate, a subtle assessment of escape routes. Before Tyrone could respond, a voice called out from the direction of the neighboring house. "Everything all right, Josh?" And then he saw her, Melanie Cowington, emerging from behind the thick hibiscus bushes that separated their properties. She strolled towards him, a practiced smile plastered on her face. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she wore a large pair of sunglasses that shielded her eyes, but not the smug satisfaction he sensed emanating from her. "They just wanted to cool off," she said, her tone airy, dismissive. "It's such a hot day." Her words hung in the air, heavy with a casual entitlement that made Tyrone's blood boil. He took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. He knew her type, the kind of person who believed rules were for other people, who saw their desires as paramount, other people's boundaries as mere suggestions. "Mrs. Cowington," he said, his voice still measured, "I do mind. This is my property. My pool. They're trespassing." Each word was precise, deliberate, a clear articulation of his position. He watched her face, searching for a flicker of remorse, a hint of understanding. But there was none. "Oh, Tyrone," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Don't be such a stickler for rules. They're just kids. It's harmless fun." She waved a hand dismissively, as though brushing away his concerns like so many pesky flies. Her nonchalance fueled his anger, but he fought to maintain his composure. He had dealt with far worse in his career. This, he told himself, was a minor inconvenience, a small battle in a larger war of maintaining his peace. He could feel his internal monologue churning, the years of police work surfacing, reminding him to observe, to assess, to document. Stay calm, Tyrone, he told himself. This isn't worth losing your cool over. But beneath the surface of his calm exterior, a storm was brewing. This wasn't just about the pool. It was about respect, about boundaries, about the right to enjoy the sanctuary of his own home without intrusion. Harmless or not, it's trespassing, he repeated, his voice firm. I've asked you before not to use my pool. I've asked you to respect my property. And yet, here we are. Melanie sighed dramatically, a theatrical display of exasperation. Honestly, Tyrone, she said, her voice laced with impatience. You're being ridiculous. It's just a pool. What's the harm? The harm, he said, his voice rising slightly, is that you continue to disregard my wishes. You continue to treat my property as your own. And that, Mrs. Covington, is unacceptable. He could see a flicker of annoyance in her eyes, a crack in the facade of her carefully constructed indifference. Good, he thought. Let her feel uncomfortable. Let her see that he wasn't going to back down. Fine, she said, her voice clipped. I'll tell them to get out. But honestly, you need to lighten up. She turned to the teenagers, who had been watching the exchange with a mixture of amusement and apprehension. Come on, kids, she said, her voice regaining its earlier cheerfulness. Let's go. Party's over. She turned and walked back towards her house, her retreat a clear signal of her unwillingness to engage further. The teenagers followed, their laughter subdued, their earlier bravado replaced with a sullen silence. Tyrone watched them go, his gaze fixed on Melanie's retreating figure. He knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. He felt a weary resignation settle over him. He had hoped for a peaceful retirement, but it seemed peace was a commodity he would have to fight for. The rhythmic clang of hammer against metal echoed in the deepening twilight, each strike a punctuation mark in the quiet symphony of Tyrone's frustration. He adjusted the latch on the gate, the newly installed hardware gleaming silver against the dark wood. A small, almost insignificant act, but it felt weighty, a symbolic barrier against the tide of Melanie Covington's entitlement. He ran a hand over the smooth metal, a strange satisfaction mingling with the lingering unease. He wasn't a confrontational man. 25 years on the force had taught him the value of calm, of measured responses. He preferred the quiet hum of normalcy, the predictable rhythm of his retirement. But this simmering anger, this slow burn of indignation, it was a new and unwelcome guest in his quiet life. He'd always considered himself a man of simple needs, content with the small pleasures, a good book, a hot cup of coffee, the peaceful solitude of his backyard. He'd envisioned his retirement as an extension of this tranquility, an unbroken expanse of quiet days stretching out before him like a calm sea. But Melanie Covington, with her blithe disregard for boundaries, was a persistent ripple disturbing the smooth surface of his peace. He tried reasoning with her, appealing to her sense of neighborly courtesy, but his words had seemed to fall on deaf ears, met with a dismissive wave and a saccharine smile. He'd watched her from his kitchen window, the way she'd sashayed across his lawn as if she owned it, the casual arrogance in her stride. Each splash, each ripple in his pool, felt like a small violation, a chipping away at the sanctity of his personal space. Now, under the cloak of the approaching night, he continued his task. He mounted the security camera, its small, unblinking eye silent sentinel overlooking the pool area. He ran a test, watching the live feed on his phone, a grainy image of his backyard bathed in the soft glow of the security light. He knew this wouldn't stop her, not really. But it would document, it would bear witness. It would be his silent, unwavering testimony. He felt a pang of something akin to sadness, a melancholic sigh escaping his lips. This wasn't how he'd envisioned spending his retirement, engaged in a silent war with a neighbor over a swimming pool. But he wouldn't be bullied. He wouldn't be intimidated. He would stand his ground, inch by inch, until she understood. The glow of his laptop illuminated his face as he sat at his kitchen table the next morning, the mug of coffee beside him growing cold. He clicked through the images captured by the security camera, each frame a stark reminder of Melanie's blatant disregard. He saw her, dressed in her floral swimsuit, towel draped casually over her shoulder, stepping onto his property without a second thought. He watched as she unlocked the gate, the new latch offering no resistance, and made her way to the pool. The anger, banked and smoldering for days, flared again, hot and sharp. He needed to talk to Denise. The phone rang 3 times before his cousin's crisp, professional voice answered. Denise speaking. Hey Denise, it's Tyrone. I need your advice. What's up, cuz? Trouble in paradise already. Her voice held a note of teasing concern. He explained the situation, the repeated trespassing, his attempts at peaceful resolution, and finally, the installation of the security camera. He could hear the shift in her tone, the professional lawyer emerging sharp and focused. Tyrone, this isn't a neighborly dispute anymore. This is trespassing. You've asked her to stop. You've made it clear she's not welcome on your property. Her continued actions are deliberate and illegal. He hesitated, the ingrained reluctance to escalate, the situation still lingering. I don't want to cause trouble, Denise. I just want her to leave me alone. Sometimes, Tyrone, the only way to get peace is to fight for it. Her voice was firm, unwavering. Document everything. Every instance of trespassing. Every conversation. The security footage is a good start. Send it to me. He followed her advice, forwarding the video clips. As he clicked send, he felt a strange sense of relief, a burden lifted. He was taking action. He was reclaiming his space. That afternoon, the doorbell rang. It was Melanie, a plastic smile plastered on her face. Tyrone, she began, her voice dripping with faux concern. I noticed you've put a lock on the gate. Is everything all right? He met her gaze, his expression carefully neutral. Next time you ask, he said, his voice quiet but firm, that's trespassing. Her smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. Trespassing? Really, Tyrone? We're neighbors. I was just using my pool without my permission. He finished, his tone unwavering. Me exactly. The mask of politeness crumbled. You're being ridiculous, she snapped, her voice rising. I've been using that pool for years. He felt a surge of anger, but he kept his voice level, controlled. Not anymore. This is my property. You don't have a right to be here without my permission. He turned to go back inside, his hand already on the doorknob. I suggest you consult with a lawyer. You'll be hearing from mine soon. He closed the door, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. He leaned against the cool wood, the adrenaline still coursing through him. He knew this wasn't over, but for the first time since this ordeal began, he felt a sense of control, a glimmer of hope that he could reclaim the peace he so desperately craved. The rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall was the only sound disturbing the quiet of Tyrone's Saturday afternoon. Sunlight streamed through the windows, painting dust motes dancing in the air a hazy gold. 2 weeks. 2 weeks of uneasy peace, punctuated by the gnawing suspicion that it was all a fragile facade. He'd installed the new lock on the gate, a heavy-duty brass thing that felt reassuringly solid in his hand. A small victory, he'd thought, a clear line drawn. But the quiet had been too quiet, the stillness pregnant with a tension Tyrone couldn't quite shake. It felt like waiting. He'd almost convinced himself it was over, that the woman next door had finally accepted the message. Almost. The notification on his phone buzzed, a small vibration against the mahogany desk. Motion detected. Backyard camera 1. Tyrone's stomach tightened. He hadn't even bothered to check the live feed these past few days, lulled into a false sense of security. Foolish. He tapped the app, the screen flickering to life, displaying the crystal-clear image of his backyard. His breath hitched. There she was, Melanie Coington, in a floral sundress, a wide-brimmed hat perched atop her head, looking as casual as if she owned the place. The simmering anger he'd banked down these past weeks flared anew. He watched, a cold knot forming in his gut, as she reached for the new lock. He'd even considered a chain and padlock, something more overtly aggressive, but had opted for the subtler, yet still firm, statement of the brass latch. Clearly, subtlety wasn't her language. She unlocked the new latch. Tyrone muttered to himself, each word a hard pellet of disbelief. How? He'd made sure it was secure. Had she picked it? The thought sparked a grim satisfaction. This wasn't just casual disregard. It was deliberate. He'd have irrefutable proof. He zoomed in on the footage, his finger hovering over the record button. He needed this. Needed the undeniable evidence of her transgression. Every click, every jiggle of the lock, every second of her unauthorized presence was being meticulously documented. The rhythmic whir of the camera's motor was a small, mechanical counterpoint to the pounding in his ears. He felt a strange detachment, like he was watching a scene unfold in a movie, the emotional weight of it held at bay by a thin sheet of icy calm. She got in. He watched as Melanie pushed open the gate, her movements imbued with a casual entitlement that grated on every raw nerve. The slight breeze rustled the leaves of the palm trees that lined the edge of the pool, their shadows swaying like dark fingers across the shimmering turquoise water. He could almost smell the chlorine, feel the cool splash of the water against his skin. His pool, his sanctuary, violated. The anger was no longer a simmer. It was a rolling boil, threatening to spill over. He clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to march out there and confront her. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction. He'd play this smart by the book, just like he'd always done. Yep, got on camera. He pressed the save button, the digital confirmation a small but significant victory. He had her. This time, there would be no denying it. No flimsy excuses. No more playing the victim. The footage was his ammunition, cold, hard, and irrefutable. He leaned back in his chair, the tension slowly easing from his shoulders. The quiet of the house felt different now, no longer oppressive, but filled with a sense of purpose. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was acting. He was taking control. He closed his eyes, taking a deep, steadying breath. The scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted from the kitchen, a familiar comfort in the midst of the turmoil. He needed to think, to strategize. Denise, his cousin, the lawyer. He'd call her, show her the footage, let her work her magic. This wasn't just about his pool anymore. It was about principle, about reclaiming his peace, about drawing a line in the sand and making sure it was respected. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the warmth of the mug a welcome sensation against his hand. He thought about the future, about the quiet evenings he'd envisioned when he'd retired. He wouldn't let Melanie Coington steal that from him. He would fight for it. He took a sip of his coffee, the bitter taste oddly satisfying. The game had changed. He wasn't the weary retiree anymore. He was Tyrone Whitaker, a man who knew how to fight for what was his. And he wouldn't back down. Not this time. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Tyrone's meticulously maintained lawn, the emerald green a stark contrast to the shimmering turquoise of his pool. He sat on his back porch, a glass of iced tea sweating in his hand, the ice clinking softly with each small movement. He'd spent the morning pruning his rose bushes, the thorns pricking his skin a small price to pay for the vibrant blooms that now graced his garden. Retirement, he'd thought, would be a symphony of quiet moments like this. Instead, it was a discordant melody punctuated by the shrieks of uninvited guests. The familiar sounds of splashing and laughter drifted from his pool area. A knot tightened in his stomach. He recognized the high-pitched giggles, different from the previous weeks, younger, more carefree. He closed his eyes, the scent of chlorine and sunscreen assaulting his senses. It was Wednesday, and like clockwork, Melanie Coington had once again transformed his backyard into her personal water park. He'd spent the last few weeks meticulously documenting every trespass, his cousin Denise's words ringing in his ears. Evidence, Tyrone. You need irrefutable evidence. His phone, loaded with video recordings and timestamps, felt heavy in his pocket, a cold, hard testament to the violation of his peace. He took a deep breath, the scent of his roses doing little to soothe the rising anger. This time, it wasn't just the adults. He could hear the distinct sounds of teenagers, their laughter sharper, their splashes more boisterous. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that these were not Melanie's grandchildren. This had escalated. He set his glass down, the clink against the wrought iron table louder than he intended. He rose, each muscle in his body tense, his mind replaying Denise's instructions. Stay calm, Tyrone. Don't engage emotionally. Let the evidence speak for itself. He walked towards the pool area, his footsteps measured and deliberate. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, the adrenaline rush of approaching a crime scene. Only this wasn't a crime scene, not in the traditional sense. This was his home, his sanctuary, invaded. He stopped at the edge of the pool, his shadow falling across the shimmering water. Melanie, clad in a bright floral swimsuit, lounged on a pool float, a drink in her hand. A group of teenage girls, their laughter echoing across the yard, splashed and played around her. They looked up, their laughter fading as they took in his presence. Melanie, Tyrone's voice was calm, controlled, the years of police work lending it a certain gravitas. Melanie looked up, her eyes widening in feigned surprise. "Oh, Tyrone, fancy seeing you here." The saccharine sweetness of her tone grated on his nerves. He saw the fleeting look of annoyance that flickered across her face before she plastered on a smile. It was the same condescending smile she'd worn every other time he'd confronted her. He knew, with a weary certainty, what she was going to say before she even opened her mouth. "I was just telling the girls how much you enjoy having us over," she said, gesturing towards the teenagers, who were now watching them with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "They're friends of my niece. They just adore swimming." The casual disregard for his property, for his repeated requests, sent a wave of anger washing over him. He clenched his jaw, reminding himself to stay calm, to let the evidence do the talking. "They won't be swimming here anymore, Melanie," he said, his voice low and steady. Melanie's smile faltered. "What do you mean?" She sat up on the float, her expression shifting from feigned innocence to genuine annoyance. "I mean," Tyrone said, pulling his phone from his pocket, "I've got 2 weeks' worth of video evidence of you trespassing on my property." He held up the phone, the screen displaying a still image of Melanie lounging in his pool from the previous week. The girls, sensing the shift in atmosphere, huddled together, their whispers barely audible. Melanie's face paled. "You wouldn't," she began, her voice laced with disbelief. "I already have," he interrupted, his voice unwavering. "I've filed a complaint with the neighborhood association and the police. They've seen the videos." "They won't," she sputtered, her eyes darting between Tyrone and the phone in his hand. "They already have," he said, his gaze steady. "Officer Bentley and Officer Salgado were here just yesterday. They reviewed the footage, they spoke with my neighbors. Mr. Waller from the association came by as well. They all agree. You're trespassing." He watched as the realization of the situation sunk in. The bravado, the entitlement, drained from her face, replaced by a look of fear, then anger. "You're going to all this trouble for what? A few kids swimming?" she exclaimed, her voice rising. "This isn't about the kids, Melanie," Tyrone said, his patience wearing thin. "This is about you. This is about you disregarding my property, my privacy, my repeated request for you to stay off my land." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the group of silent teenagers. "This isn't your yard. You're just doing this because," she began, her voice trailing off, her eyes narrowed. "I didn't say a word about race, Melanie," Tyrone interrupted, his voice even. He saw the flicker of guilt, the momentary flash of shame in her eyes. He knew what she was going to say, the unspoken accusation hanging heavy in the air. He'd anticipated it, braced himself for it. But he wouldn't let her play that card. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction. He turned, his gaze sweeping over his meticulously manicured lawn, the vibrant roses, the pristine pool, the quiet sanctuary he'd worked so hard to create. He thought of the countless hours he'd spent cultivating this space, his haven, his escape from the world. He thought of the peace he'd craved in retirement, the quiet moments he'd envisioned. And then he looked back at Melanie, her face a mask of anger and resentment. "This is my property," he said, his voice firm, his tone brooking no argument. "And I will not tolerate anyone, regardless of who they are, disrespecting it." He met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. "Get your things, Melanie, and tell your friends it's time to leave." The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the loudest sound in the house. Tyrone sat at his kitchen table, the muted glow of his laptop screen illuminating the meticulously organized stack of papers beside it. Each sheet was a carefully documented instance of Melanie Coington's trespass dates, times, even crude sketches of her and her guests lounging by his pool as if they owned the place. He'd initially hesitated, the old police instinct to de-escalate, to give the benefit of the doubt, warring with the simmering resentment in his gut. He'd given her chances, spoken to her calmly, but the smirk on her face, the dismissive wave of her hand, those had spoken volumes. This wasn't about a pool. It was about entitlement, a blatant disregard for boundaries he'd spent his career upholding. He sipped his lukewarm coffee, the bitter taste mirroring his mood. Covington Incidents, Summer 25. The title he'd typed at the top of each page mocked him with its bureaucratic neatness. He'd thought retirement would be about letting go of this kind of meticulous record-keeping, not applying it to his own backyard. He printed each page, the whir of the machine a small, mechanical victory against the quiet fury consuming him. He added them to the growing file, a physical manifestation of his resolve. He wasn't going to let this slide. Later that week, he drove to the police station, the familiar building now seen through the lens of a civilian. The young officer at the desk, barely out of academy by the looks of him, listened patiently, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Tyrone knew that look. He'd worn it himself countless times. The veiled skepticism of a cop hearing a story for the 100th time, trying to decipher the truth from a noise. Tyrone laid out his evidence, each document a precise, irrefutable detail. Photographs, time-stamped security footage, witness statements from Calvin, his neighbor. The officer's expression shifted, the skepticism replaced by a professional neutrality. A report was filed. A small, unsatisfying step, but a step nonetheless. The following week passed in a fragile peace. The pool remained undisturbed, the backyard silent except for the chirping of crickets. He almost allowed himself to believe it was over. He'd even started to think he'd been too harsh, too quick to escalate. Maybe she'd gotten the message. He allowed himself a cautious exhale, the tension slowly bleeding from his shoulders. Maybe retirement would finally bring the quiet he craved. The illusion shattered on a Saturday afternoon. The sound of splashing, of laughter, of uninvited merriment drifted through his open window. He felt a cold dread creep up his spine, a chilling premonition that the fight was far from over. He peered through the blinds, his heart sinking as he watched Melanie Coington, this time accompanied by a group of 4 other women, all around her age, all radiating the same air of careless entitlement. They were setting up a picnic blanket, a portable speaker blasting some saccharine pop song. The familiar rage simmered, hotter this time, laced with a deep sense of violation. He thought of calling the police again, but something held him back. This wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about reclaiming his space, his peace. He grabbed his phone, his hand steady despite the tremor of anger running through him. He walked outside, the camera rolling. "Covington," he said, his voice level, each word a precise punctuation mark against the backdrop of their laughter. The women turned, their smiles faltering as they saw him, the phone held aloft. "You figured wrong." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. He panned the camera across their faces, capturing their expressions of surprised indignation. "You're trespassing," he continued, his gaze fixed on Melanie. "All of you." Melanie's face contorted in a mask of disbelief. "This is ridiculous, Tyrone. We were just—" He cut her off, his voice edged with steel. "You lied." He was referring to her earlier claim of misunderstanding, of thinking the pool was communal. The lie hung between them, thick and undeniable. He stopped recording, the silence that followed amplifying the tension. He turned and walked back inside, the weight of the confrontation settling heavily on his shoulders. He immediately texted Calvin, asking him to come over. He needed a witness, someone to corroborate what he'd just seen and heard. He poured himself a glass of water, his hands trembling slightly. He felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. He was tired of fighting, yet he knew he couldn't give up. He'd built his life on upholding the law, on protecting others. Now he had to protect himself, his own small piece of peace. He looked out the window again, watching the women pack up their things, their movements hurried, their laughter gone. He knew this wasn't over. He knew Melanie Covington wouldn't surrender easily. But he also knew, with a grim certainty, that he wouldn't either. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Tyrone's meticulously manicured lawn, the kind of peaceful scene he'd envisioned for his retirement. A faint chlorine scent hung in the air, a stark reminder of the intrusions that had plagued his tranquility. He stood by the French doors leading to his patio, a manila envelope clutched in his hand, its contents the culmination of weeks of meticulous documentation. A knot tightened in his stomach, a mix of weariness and grim satisfaction. He'd hoped it wouldn't come to this, but Melanie Covington had left him no choice. The sound of splashing and laughter, overly loud and deliberately carefree, grated on his nerves. He recognized the voices, the same group that had occupied his pool last weekend. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the confrontation. He opened the French doors, the click of the latch echoing in the sudden hush that fell over the group in the pool. 3 women, Melanie included, bobbed in the water, drinks precariously balanced on inflatable rafts. Melanie, in a bright pink swimsuit that clashed violently with her sunburnt skin, raised an eyebrow. "Oh, it's you, Tyrone. We were just wondering where you were. Lovely day for a swim, isn't it?" Her tone dripped with a false sweetness that set Tyrone's teeth on edge. Playing the innocent act again, he thought, his grip tightening on the envelope. "Melanie," he began, his voice leveled despite the simmering anger beneath the surface. "We need to talk. All of you need to get out of my pool." A ripple of unease passed through the group. One of the women, a blonde with oversized sunglasses perched on her nose, giggled nervously. "Oh, come on, Tyrone. Don't be such a grump." Melanie said it was okay. Tyrone felt a surge of anger. This blatant disregard for his property, the casual assumption of permission, was infuriating. "Melanie," he said, his voice hardening, "you told him I gave you permission to use my pool?" Melanie feigned confusion, her face a mask of innocent bewilderment. "Well, yes. We talked about it, remember? You said you didn't mind if a few friends joined me occasionally." Tyrone's internal monologue was a roaring torrent. Lies. All lies. She's twisting everything, trying to make me look like the unreasonable one. He felt a flicker of doubt, a whisper of uncertainty. What if they believe her? What if this turns into a he-said-she-said situation? He pushed the doubt aside, reminding himself of the evidence he held in his hand. "Melanie," he said, his voice controlled and steady, "I have security camera footage of you and your friends using my pool without my permission. Multiple times. I have dates, times, everything documented." He held up the envelope. "And," he continued, "I have witnesses. Neighbors who have seen you coming into my yard, using my pool without my consent." The bravado drained from Melanie's face, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. The other women exchanged uneasy glances. The blonde with the sunglasses stammered, but Melanie said. Melanie cut her off, her voice sharp. "Shut up, Brenda." She turned back to Tyrone, her face a mask of anger. "You've officially lost your mind. Spying on your neighbors, setting up cameras, it's creepy, Tyrone. Really creepy. Projecting, always projecting," Tyrone thought, his frustration mounting. "I'm protecting my property, Melanie. Something you seem incapable of respecting." He took a step closer, his voice low and menacing. "I didn't host anyone. I didn't give anyone permission to use my pool. And you," he pointed a finger at her, "you're never stepping foot in my yard again." The silence that followed was thick with tension. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows, making the scene feel surreal. Melanie's eyes darted around, searching for an escape. The bravado, the entitlement, had evaporated, leaving behind a raw vulnerability. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think you'd mind. The pool's so big, and you're never out here." Her voice trailed off, the words choked with a mixture of shame and resentment. I wanted to enjoy it too." Tyrone's internal monologue was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. An apology? Is she actually apologizing? After all this? He felt a surge of something akin to pity, a fleeting understanding of the loneliness that might have driven her to such desperate measures. But the pity was quickly overshadowed by the lingering resentment, the weeks of frustration and violated privacy. He looked at her, his gaze steady and unwavering. "It's not about the size of the pool, Melanie. It's about respect. Respect for other people's property, respect for their boundaries." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I accept your apology," he said, his voice softening slightly. "But this doesn't change the fact that you trespassed. Repeatedly. I've already filed a complaint with the neighborhood association, and I've documented everything for the police. If this happens again, I won't hesitate to press charges." He turned and walked back into his house, leaving Melanie and her friends to the gathering twilight and the weight of their exposed deception. The silence in his backyard, finally unbroken and his own, felt like a victory. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Tyrone's living room floor, the dust motes dancing in the golden light, a stark contrast to the knot tightening in his stomach. He'd just hung up the phone, the dispatcher's clipped tones echoing in his ears a complaint from Melanie. He rubbed his temples, the familiar pressure building behind his eyes. Retirement was supposed to be about peace, about leaving the constant tension of the job behind. But here he was, bracing himself for another confrontation, the familiar adrenaline creeping in. He'd known this might happen, anticipated it even, meticulously documenting every trespass, every violation. Yet a part of him, the part that craved quiet, still recoiled at the prospect. He glanced at the flash drive lying on the coffee table, a small, innocuous object containing hours of footage, a silent testament to Melanie's persistent intrusions. He'd spent countless hours reviewing it, each click of the mouse a bitter reminder of his stolen tranquility. A knock echoed through the house, sharp and insistent. He took a deep breath, the scent of jasmine from his backyard garden briefly calming his nerves, a fleeting reminder of the peace he was fighting to reclaim. Two uniformed officers stood on his porch, their expressions neutral, professional. Officer Bentley, a young woman with sharp eyes, and Officer Salgado, a seasoned veteran with a world weariness that Tyrone recognized all too well. He invited them in, the familiar protocol of his former life kicking in, even as he reminded himself he was on the other side now. The living room felt smaller, the air thicker with unspoken tension. "We got a call from a neighbor, Mr. Whitaker," Officer Bentley began, her voice crisp and clear. Tyrone noted the subtle way her gaze swept over the room, assessing, evaluating. He'd done the same countless times, the automatic reflex of a cop, never truly off duty, even in retirement. "A Ms. Coington claims you've been harassing her." Tyrone felt a flicker of anger, the accusation so blatantly false it almost made him laugh. But he suppressed the urge, reminding himself to remain calm, to let the evidence speak for itself. He knew the game, the delicate dance of perception, the importance of appearing cooperative, even as a storm raged within. "Harassment, officer? I assure you, I've done nothing of the sort." His voice was even, controlled, a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing beneath the surface. He could almost hear Denise's voice, her legal counsel echoing in his mind, "Stay calm. Stick to the facts. She claims you've been filming her, invading her privacy," Officer Salgado added, his tone less accusatory, tinged with a hint of skepticism. Tyrone saw it, the subtle shift in his posture, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the unspoken question hanging in the air. He had seen that look before, the seasoned cop's instinct, the ability to read between the lines. This was the moment. He gestured towards a flash drive on the coffee table. "Everything you need is on that drive, officers. Timestamps, Dates, clear footage. She's been trespassing on my property, using my pool without permission. Repeatedly. I've asked her to stop, politely, repeatedly. She refused. This, he tapped the drive, is my documentation of her continued disregard for my property rights. He watched as they reviewed the footage, the silence in the room punctuated only by the whirring of the laptop. He saw their expressions change, the initial neutrality replaced by a dawning understanding, a hardening of their gazes. The evidence was irrefutable, a silent indictment playing out on the screen. He felt a sense of vindication, a small victory in a battle that had drained him. When the video ended, Officer Bentley closed the laptop, her expression firm. "She's been warned, Mr. Whitaker. We'll be having a word with Ms. Coington." Officer Salgado nodded in agreement, his gaze meeting Tyrone's. "She picked the wrong one," he said, a hint of something akin to respect in his voice. The words, simple yet potent, resonated with Tyrone, a validation of his actions, a confirmation that he was in the right. As they left, Tyrone stood by the door, watching their patrol car pull away. The tension that had coiled tight in his chest began to ease, replaced by a sense of weary relief. He closed his eyes, inhaling the jasmine-scented air, the peace of his garden no longer tainted by the shadow of intrusion. He had fought for his tranquility, and he had won. The fight had been exhausting, a constant drain on his energy and peace of mind, but it was over. He could finally breathe. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Tyrone's meticulously manicured lawn, the kind of peaceful scene he'd envisioned for his retirement. A cardinal perched on the bird feeder, its scarlet a vibrant splash against the green. He watched it from the porch swing, a glass of iced tea sweating in his hand. The quiet chirping, the gentle creak of the swing, this was what he'd craved after years on the force. A rhythm of serenity he wouldn't allow to be disrupted. He took a long swallow of the sweet tea, the coolness a balm against the lingering summer heat. It was a stark contrast to the simmering anger he'd carried within him for weeks. The tension had knotted his shoulders, tightened his jaw, a constant hum beneath the surface of his forced calm. Now, finally, the knot began to loosen. The neighborhood association meeting had concluded just an hour ago. Mr. Waller, his face creased with a thoughtful frown, had reviewed the meticulous log Tyrone had kept, the dates, the times, the photographs. He'd listened patiently to Calvin's corroborating account, nodding slowly as each piece of evidence slotted into place. Tyrone had felt a flicker of satisfaction, a quiet vindication, as Mr. Waller finally turned to him, his expression shifting from skepticism to understanding. "Mr. Whitaker," he'd said, his voice low and apologetic, "I see now. This isn't a simple misunderstanding. Mrs. Coington has clearly overstepped." The words, so simple, yet so weighty, had lifted a burden Tyrone hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying. He'd simply nodded in response, his throat suddenly tight. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the sun soak into his skin. The memory of Melanie's indignant sputtering at the meeting, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment, played through his mind. She tried to defend herself, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that she thought she had permission. But the evidence, so carefully gathered, spoke for itself. Even her usual allies on the board had fallen silent, their faces a mixture of discomfort and disapproval. Tyrone had watched her, not with triumph, but with a profound weariness. He hadn't wanted this confrontation, hadn't sought this victory. All he'd wanted was the simple, uninterrupted peace of his own backyard. A shadow fell across the lawn. He opened his eyes, expecting to see a cloud obscuring the sun. Instead, Melanie Coington stood at the edge of his property, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. He felt a surge of annoyance, a brief flare of the anger he'd thought extinguished. What now? Was she going to try to argue her case again, to rehash the same tired excuses? He braced himself, steeling his resolve. He wouldn't engage, wouldn't let her drag him back into the mire of her entitlement. He watched her approach, her steps hesitant, her usual swagger replaced by an unfamiliar uncertainty. "Mr. Whitaker," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, so unlike her usual booming pronouncements. "I came to apologize." The words hung in the air, fragile and unexpected. Tyrone stared at her, his mind struggling to reconcile the woman before him with the brazen trespasser he'd come to know. He said nothing, waiting, watching. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere just beyond his shoulder. "I was wrong," she continued, the words seemingly dragged from her throat. "You had every right to be upset. She finally met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of shame and something else he couldn't quite decipher. "You should have done that from the beginning," she added, her voice laced with a hint of resentment, a flicker of the old Melanie. He saw it, that fleeting spark of defiance, and understood. This apology wasn't genuine remorse. It was a concession, forced upon her by the weight of evidence and the disapproval of her peers. He took another slow sip of his tea, the ice clinking against the glass, the sound amplified in the sudden stillness. He considered her words, turning them over in his mind, searching for the appropriate response. He could tell her that she was right, that he should have taken action sooner. He could unleash the frustration he'd kept bottled up for so long, point out the blatant disregard she'd shown for his property and his privacy. But what good would it do? The neighborhood association had ruled, the matter was settled. He'd won. He had his peace. "Mrs. Coington," he finally said, his voice even and controlled, "I appreciate the apology." He didn't offer forgiveness, didn't extend a hand in reconciliation. He simply acknowledged her words, a small, quiet victory in itself. The slight tremor in her hand, the way her shoulders slumped, told him more than any verbal admission could. She'd been humbled, her sense of entitlement chipped away by the undeniable truth. She nodded, a curt, jerky movement. "Well," she murmured, "I should be going." She turned and walked away, her steps quicker now, almost a retreat. He watched her go, the tension slowly draining from his body. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The cardinal had flown off, but the quiet chirping of crickets filled the air. He took a deep breath, the evening air cool and fragrant. He was alone again, in his backyard, surrounded by the peace he'd fought so hard to reclaim. It was a hard-won peace, but a peace nonetheless. He closed his eyes again, a small smile playing on his lips. The swing creaked gently, a soothing rhythm in the twilight. He was home. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Tyrone's backyard, painting the freshly mown lawn in hues of amber and gold. A week had passed since the last unwelcome splash disturbed the quiet of his retirement, a week of blessed silence. He sat on the patio, a glass of iced tea sweating on the table beside him, the gentle hum of bees in his lavender bushes the only sound. Tyrone closed his eyes, inhaling the sweet scent of the flowers, a sense of tranquility settling over him like a warm blanket. It was a hard-won peace, a victory not of brute force, but of meticulous planning and unwavering resolve. He'd spent his career navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the justice system, and this, in its own way, felt like another case closed. He thought of Melanie's face, contorted with a mixture of disbelief and resentment as officers Bentley and Salgado had escorted her off his property. The memory didn't bring him joy, not exactly. It was more a sense of quiet satisfaction, a confirmation that even in retirement, the principles of law and order still held sway. He opened his eyes, his gaze drifting over the sparkling surface of his pool, the water undisturbed, a perfect rectangle of blue under the vast expanse of the Texas sky. This was his sanctuary, his reward for years of service, and he had reclaimed it. The click of the gate latch broke the spell of quietude. Tyrone turned, a flicker of apprehension momentarily tightening his chest. It was Calvin, his neighbor from across the street, a man whose easygoing demeanor and unwavering support had been a lifeline during the ordeal. Calvin's smile was warm and genuine, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Afternoon, Tyrone. Mind if I join you?" Tyrone gestured to the empty chair. "Be my guest, Calvin." He felt a warmth spread through him, a quiet gratitude for the simple act of companionship. This, too, was a part of the peace he had fought for, the ability to enjoy the company of friends without the shadow of intrusion hanging over him. Calvin settled into the chair, his gaze sweeping over the backyard. "Quiet today, isn't it?" he remarked, a knowing glint in his eyes. Tyrone chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "Quiet is an understatement. It's the kind of quiet you can almost taste." He took a sip of his tea, the cool liquid a balm on his throat. Calvin leaned back, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know, Tyrone, what you did, it took guts. Not everyone would have had the patience, the sheer tenacity to see it through." Tyrone's hand tightened around his glass. He hadn't thought of it as courageous, not really. It had simply felt necessary. He'd done what any reasonable person would do: protect their home, their privacy, their right to peace. "I did it so I could sleep," Tyrone said, his voice quiet, the words hanging in the air between them. He hadn't realized how much the constant vigilance, the simmering frustration, had been eating away at him until it was gone. The nights were quiet again, his sleep unbroken by the phantom sounds of splashing or the intrusive glare of security lights. "That's what she wanted," he continued, his gaze fixed on the shimmering water of the pool. "To wear me down, to make it easier for her to just take what wasn't hers." He paused, a wry smile touching his lips. "Because people like Melanie, they don't expect the quiet ones to win." He knew Melanie's type. They thrived on the assumption that their entitlement would be met with passive acquiescence. They mistook quiet for weakness, patience for indifference. They underestimated the power of a calm, methodical mind, the strength that came from knowing the law, from following the rules, from documenting every trespass, every infraction, every lie. He played the long game, and he'd won. Calvin nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and understanding. "It's a lesson some folks need to learn the hard way," he said. "And the ripple effect, well, let's just say the neighborhood's breathing a collective sigh of relief." Tyrone raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Ripple effect?" Calvin chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "Word travels fast, Tyrone, especially in a place like this." He leaned forward conspiratorially. "Mrs. Henderson's been having trouble with the kids next door, letting their dog use her flower beds as a bathroom. Guess who she called for advice?" Tyrone smiled, a genuine smile this time, a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the Texas sun. He hadn't set out to be an example, a beacon of quiet resistance. But if his actions had empowered others to stand up for themselves, to protect their own little corners of the world, then maybe, just maybe, it had all been worth it. The silence settled again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the strained silence of anticipation, of waiting for the next intrusion. It was the comfortable silence of shared understanding, of mutual respect, of a community finding its equilibrium. It was the silence of peace, finally and truly his own.